Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope everybody's doing well. We're going to be continuing our discussion on the derivative, and today we're going to be discussing the quotient rule. Let's begin. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to my channel. Suppose I have a function h of x defined as a quotient of two functions f and g as given above, where f is the upper function and g is the lower function, and we want to find the derivative of that function, f over g. The quotient rule tells us that to find the derivative, we take the bottom function multiplied by the derivative of the top function minus the top function multiplied by the derivative of the bottom function all over the bottom function squared. Best way to illustrate is through an example. Let's take an example. Suppose I have h of x equals x over x minus 1. And we're asked to find h primed of x. So we begin. H primed of x is the bottom function multiplied by the derivative of the top function minus the top function, which is x, multiplied by the derivative of the bottom function all over the bottom function squared. This is our g multiplied by f prime minus f multiplied by g prime all over g squared. So continuing we have h primed of x is x minus 1 multiplied by the derivative of x is just 1 minus x multiplied by the derivative of x minus 1 again is just 1 all over the bottom squared. And continuing, we work on the top here. So we have x minus 1 on top minus x all over x minus 1 squared. We have an x here and a minus x here. That's just 0. And then minus 1 all over x minus 1 squared. Let us take a look at another example. Suppose I had a function f of z equals 1 plus the square root of z all over z cubed. And we are asked to find f primed of z, or the derivative of f, which is really df of z dz. Well, using the quotient rule, that says the bottom times the derivative of the top minus the top times the derivative of the bottom all over the bottom squared. Please remember that the derivative of the square root of z is 1 over 2 square root of z. So continuing, we have f primed of z is z cubed multiplied by the derivative of this term, 1 plus the square root of z, is going to be 1 over 2 root z minus 1 plus square root of z, and the derivative of this term, z cubed, is just 3z squared according to the power rule. And then on the bottom, we have z cubed squared is z to the power of 6. So here we have a z cubed divided by the square root of z. So we can say z cubed divided by the square root of z is z cubed multiplied by z to the minus 1/2, which is z to the power of 2.5, which is z 5/2. So this term is going to be 1/2 z to the 5/2 minus, then we multiply this through, we have 3z squared minus 3. I'm multiplying this term by this term. And z squared multiplied by the square root of z is going to be z to the 2.5, which is 5/2, all over z to the power 6. So continuing, we have f primed of z. Now we can gather, we have a 1/2 z to the 5/2 here, and a minus 3z to the 5/2 here. So that's going to be minus 2.5 z to the 5/2 minus 3z squared all over z to the 6. Continuing, we have f primed of z. Minus 2.5 is really minus 5/2. And then we have z 5/2. Now I'm going to bring the z to the 6th on top, which will become z minus 6 minus 3z squared times z minus 6, which is minus 5/2. And then we have z to the 5/2 and multiplied by z minus 6. It could be rewritten as minus 12 over 2 minus 3z squared multiplied by z to the minus 6 is z to the minus 4, which is minus 5/2. We can reduce this by adding exponents. 5/2 minus 12/2 is minus, so z minus 7/2 minus 3z to the minus 4. Or we can rewrite this as minus 5/2 multiplied by 1 over z to the 7/2 minus 3 all over z to the power of 4. Or writing it a little nicer is minus 5 over 2z 7/2 minus 3 over z to the 4. Let's look at another example. Suppose I had a function g of t equals 1 minus square root of t divided by 1 plus the square root of t, and we're asked to find g primed of t. Well, it's a quotient, so we proceed with a quotient rule. G primed of t is going to be the bottom multiplied by the derivative of the top minus the top times the derivative of the bottom all over the bottom squared. So we have, continuing, g prime of t is 1 plus square root of t. Now we need to take the derivative of this term. The derivative of 1 is 0. The derivative of minus square root t is going to be 1 over 2 root t minus this term, 1 minus root t, times the derivative of this term. The derivative of 1 plus square root of t is going to be 1 over 2 root t. And then we have our 1 plus square root of t squared on the bottom. Continuing, we have g prime of t is... Now let us multiply this term through. So we're going to have minus 1 over 2 root t plus, we have minus here. We have minus 1 over 2 root t multiplied by root t. It's going to be minus root t over 2 root t. Then we have a minus sign here, right here, minus sign. So we have this term multiplied by this term is going to be minus 1 over 2 root t. And then we have a minus minus, that's going to give us a plus root t over 2 root t. And then we have our 1 plus square root of t squared on the bottom. Continuing, we have g prime of t is, looking at the top, we can combine this term and this term. So minus 1/2 over root t, minus 1/2 over root t is going to be minus 1 over root t. And then we can combine this term is minus and this term is plus, which will be 0. And then we have our bottom 1 plus square root of t squared, or g prime of t is minus 1 all over square root of t 1 plus square root of t squared. And that does that. Again, I appreciate it if you click like, subscribe, comment below. This helps me a lot. Let's move on to the next example. Suppose I had s of t is t cubed divided by 1 plus the square root of t. And we were asked to find s prime of t. Using the quotient rule, we say the bottom multiplied by the derivative of the top minus the top times the derivative of the bottom all over the bottom squared. So we have s prime of t is 1 plus square root of t. The derivative of t cubed is just going to be 3t squared. Then we have a minus t cubed multiplied by the derivative of 1 plus the square root of t is going to be 1/2 root t. And then we have the bottom squared. Moving along, we multiply this term out. So we'll have s prime of t is 3t squared plus 3t squared times root t, which is just t to the 1/2. I'm just writing everything out, minus t cubed over 2 times t to the minus 1/2. T to the minus 1/2 is just the root t on the bottom. I brought it on top. And then we have plus 1 plus root t squared on the bottom. So continuing, we have s prime of t is, we have 3t squared plus 3t squared multiplied by t to the 1/2 is going to be 3t to the 2.5, which is 5/2, minus, now we have 1/2 multiplied by t cubed times t to the minus 1/2 is t to 2.5, which is 5/2, all over 1 plus the square root of t squared. So continuing, we have s prime of t is, we have 3t squared here. Now we have plus 3t to the 5/2 minus 1/2 t to the 5/2 is going to be plus 2.5 t to the 5/2 all over 1 plus the square root of t squared, which, simplifying the top, we have 3t squared plus 2.5, which is really 5/2 t to the 5/2 all over 1 plus the square root of t squared. So you can see in a lot of these examples, the calculus is just one step, but there's a lot of algebra, a lot of simplification. This causes some challenge, but the more and more you do the problems, the more and more you're going to get confident and do work very smoothly through everything. So you have to be able to do derivative of square roots on the top, on the bottom. You have to be able to add exponents, subtract exponents. And if you can do all those things, you'll be very good at this stuff. Thank you for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you again. Click like, subscribe, and comment below. Have a great day.